we unearthed a time traveler ship at an archaeological dig. By Toucan the Rapper. Read by Batman. No introduction needed, right? Archaeological dig? Time traveler ship? You want me to get to the point. This works for me because I don't have long before the government spooks figure out which car I'm hiding under. I won't bother telling you how I graduated from Oxford, or how I was pulled out of my previous dig, salvaging the Bamayam Buddhas in Afghanistan when the US and company withdrew. All you need to know is I went with them, and that's how I found myself about 50 miles southwest of Las Vegas, staring at a pearlescent metal hatch. Blimey, Freddy, you weren't kidding. I whistled, scratching the mole on my chin, staring at the mottled blue steel column protruding from orange earth at the bottom of the 30-foot pit. Even though I was used to the baking sun from my time in Hazarajat Highlands, the shade and coolness of the pit were welcome by the time Freddy and I had climbed down there. I told you, Freddy said, taking off his battered trucker cap to scratch his balding head. It's a goddamn flying saucer. I don't know about an alien spacecraft, but it's definitely older than any metal construction buried here has any right being. Leona stood, brushing the dust off her knees, and turned away from the oil barrel-sized column with its wheel-lock hatch roof. She greeted me with a warm hug. Freddy, a nod. This was unsurprising. Leona and I had been undergraduates together at Oxford. Leona and Freddy had only met the day before when her current university had called her about the phone call they'd received from him the day before that. She'd called me when she arrived because I'd called her the previous week to let her know I was safely out of Afghanistan. I'd agreed because of how Freddy found the hatch, or, more accurately, why he'd been digging up the remote stretch of the desert he'd somehow come to own. He'd told Liana's university, who told Liana, who told me, that he'd found a treasure map. He owned a house on the same land. While renovating the remote property, he'd found the map and coordinates hidden under some floorboards. 3 days ago, he'd rented a bulldozer and started going to town until he found the hatch. He'd told the university he'd found a UFO. The university told Leona she still owed them for the prescription opioid addiction they kept hushed up. She told me a lot of swear words in French. I told her I'd get the next plane ticket from Wisconsin once I was done being processed at Fort McCoy. Confusing? Sorry. All you need to know is that everyone was where they were when Scott, who none of us knew, removed his headphones and turned off the metal detector he'd been waving around. It's definitely not a saucer, he said, scratching his goatee. Wherever this leads, it goes off in one direction. No signal around any edges of the pit except where you're stood. If it is a ship, this is at the nose. He gestured with a thumb over his shoulder to the hatch, his words intercut with a smack of chewing gum. So like a pirate ship? Freddy asked, raising a pudgy eyebrow at the news the thing buried on his land wasn't a UFO. Just like the one his grandpappy was there when they found at Roswell. More like a submarine, I'll bet. That is, if it is a ship. It's probably just a bunker left here by some prepper during the Cold War. A bunker that's over 5,000 years old? Leona had her hands on her hips, graying-haired face incredulous. I've seen a lot of buried metal. I don't know what this thing is made of, but it looks like steel. Do you know how long steel takes to rust? When it's buried somewhere as dry as the desert? Seigneur, c'est moi de cet imbécile. I couldn't see Scott's eyes behind the sunglasses, but I know they looked sheepish. It had been decades since I'd made the impatient Leona swear in her native tongue, but I still remembered the experience. I felt for Scott. If he was here and Leona was here, it meant he was Leona's assistant. This meant he was an undergrad. If there was one thing Leona couldn't stand, even when she was one, it was undergrads. Fortunately for Scott, and for you if you're bored of a middle-aged man getting nostalgic for a former flame, we weren't in the awkward silence long. The shrill hiss was deafening as soon as it started. Oh, hell no. Freddy reached a pudgy arm into a duffel bag at the base of the pit's ladder. When he stood back up, the meaty limb was holding a shotgun. Before we three academics could register what was going on, Freddy had the barrel pointed at the corroded pearlescent steel column. Oui, bien sûr. Un bon camp de la guerre voile. Putain d'étudiant. Leona threw herself to the pit's edge, yelling, grabbing Scott by the arm and taking him with her as she went. They fell to the ground just in time to avoid being blasted by the thick vapor projected from 3/5 of the hatch's rim. Had Freddy and I stood a fraction to the right, we'd have had to do the same. I ducked anyway, though, only because the sudden high-pitched gaseous whistling triggered the attuned fight-or-flight response I'd honed back in Afghanistan. It wasn't until I looked up that I realized how lucky Scott was that Leona had developed the same senses during the time with me she'd spent there, living under the constant threat of rockets, grenades, and gunfire. The flat, almost ring of steam reached all the way to the walls of the pit. Once it subsided after a few seconds of whistling, the densely packed sand and rock wasn't sand and rock anymore. It was glass. Sparkling, slightly glowing, still cooling glass. Thanks, Professor, Scott mumbled, pulling himself to his feet once the hatch had stopped shrieking. The sheepish look I imagined behind those dark sunglasses had only gotten worse. Never mention it. Leona was already on her feet, once again brushing dust from her khakis. She turned to Fred. Monsieur Frederick, please put down the gun. Freddy spat on the orange earth. The hell I will. I ain't about to let myself get eaten by some space monster. Mon Dieu, qu'est-ce qu'il y a avec les hommes et les hommes? Monsieur Frederick, please. Whatever we're dealing with here, I don't think it's a thunk. Only Freddy didn't throw himself back to the pit floor. He raised the shotgun, aiming down the sights at the turning rusted wheel on the center of the hatch. Leona, Scott, and I could only look up at the corroded steel column, mouths agape, as a wheel lock unscrewed. It turned for 30 long seconds, unseen gears and cogs grinding for the first time in, according to Leona's assessment, millennia. Leona wasn't protesting anymore. She'd run out of words, French or English. She was staring with wide eyes at the hatch, just like the men of the pit, too shocked to speak. She didn't even have words when there was a second loud thunk, followed by a loud creaking. The fiery archaeology professor was silent, even as the rusted circular plate started to open on its thick, ancient hinges. She didn't need words when it clanged fully open, with a last energetic swing. None of us did. We were too busy screaming. That's when I learned Freddy wasn't a man who messed around. I heard the click of him readying his weapon the instant the two sets of rubber-covered fingers appeared on the rim. He grunted in unison with the top of a helmeted head emerging. He already fired before I got a chance to take in any details of the figure pulling itself out the hole. Qu'est-ce que non tu dois mouver avec vous? Vous potent des Américains. We, unarmed three, screamed again. We heard the distant metallic thump of the headless body hitting the bottom of the shaft within the pit, but not before we had time to wipe blood and glass from our shocked faces. See? Freddy yelled with a grin, staring around at the mess of bone, glass, gore, and plastic on the opposite wall. I told you nerds it was a UFO. I told you there'd be a space monster. Ugh, this blood tastes real human for a space monster. Scott was still laying on the floor, spitting dramatically and wiping flecks of splatter from his goatee. What? I'm just saying what we're all thinking, he added when he saw Leona and I's horrified expressions. I couldn't argue with him, though. If you're screaming while in the presence of someone getting shot with a shotgun at point-blank range, chances are you're going to get some blood in your mouth. I recognized the coppery tang on my tongue, too. I also couldn't shake the knowledge that chances of an alien having fingers and hands shaped exactly like a human being were astronomically slim. We couldn't stop Freddy going down the hole, though we did try. We followed him, of course. Leona and I weren't about to let whatever lay inside this, whatever it was, be claimed by a redneck with a bloodlust for aliens. Scott came too, but he didn't have a choice, because when he protested, Leona swore at him in French, and that was the end of that. We were descending the ladder for about 2 minutes before we reached the bottom. Good thing I packed flashlights, eh? Sure enough, Freddy had 3 battery-powered torches in the duffel bag he'd slung over his shoulder before climbing into the hatch. This was indeed a good thing, too, because the space at the bottom was pitch black, aside from the thin rays of Nevada's sun able to find their way this far down the hole. Scott vomited when they clicked into life, and even Freddy let out a Jesus followed by a sharp intake of breath. The figure Freddy shot had broken several limbs as it tumbled down the hole. A fair few more when it landed at the bottom. There were a few sharp bones poking through its dark rubber suit. It didn't have a head because, as you'll recall, Freddy had eviscerated its head with buckshot. What did remain of the lower jaw, neck, and base of the skull was surrounded by the remnants of a thick plastic-looking helmet. The interior was lined with a lime green gel, and various pipes and frayed wires ran from the interior into a thick tube. The socket where this tube would have connected had been lost to Freddy's shotgun, but the pack full of fluids with a wire and pipe-filled cable trailing from it allowed me to paint a rough picture. One I'd confirmed in a few moments once we started exploring the rest of the ship. What shocked me about the figure, what caused me to yell, and Leona to clasp a pair of hands to her mouth, was a name badge on the headless, distressingly human, female corpse's chest. Ipsit, Dr. Harper Gerard. A name you know? Freddy asked, poking the body with his gun. Mine. Leona and I replied in unison, shooting each other an awkward glance immediately after. Freddy looked confused. Well, mine is Harper, hers is Gerard, I explained. Surely the university sent some paperwork. He shrugged. They might have done, but I'll be honest, the wife checks the mail. I just knew they were sending some science folk to poke around and signed a bit of paper that said I'd found a bona fide UFO. Leona rolled her eyes before turning to me. What do you think it means? What's Ipsit? I'm frightened, Robert. I know, I replied, me too. I recognize those hips there. I know. I shot her a glare. I couldn't bear to hear out loud the observation we'd both made. I recognize those hips too. I'd spent a whole evening staring at them on a dance floor many decades ago. On the first night Leona and I's friendship gained the suffix, with benefits. We both tried to ignore our growing fears as we poked around the ship's entrance. The word Ipsit meant nothing to me at the time. It wasn't until my torch illuminated some signage on the rusty wall, spelling out Institute of Paranormal Science, Events, and Technology, that I even knew it was an acronym. Other than this revelatory information, the room was pretty barren save for a rack containing another suit of the same kind the now deceased Dr. Harper Gerard had been wearing. Scott had been right. The hatch was indeed at the nose of the ship. The room was a sharp triangle shape, with the suit storage set into the thin wall at one end. The wider one at the other was featureless save for a door and keypad. The keypad was a kind of fingerprint scanner. Its screen was still half illuminated, despite the rust and chipped paint of the walls and floor grates. The small LED flashed red with Freddy and Scott pressed their thumbs on the surface. With a faint beep, it turned green for Leona, prompting a gulp from us both. Her hand found its way into mine when the steel door hissed and slid open. Something that hadn't happened for a long time. "Holy shit!" Freddy yelled, when we'd collectively had enough time to try and make sense of the room beyond. "You still don't think this is a UFO?" "No," Scott replied, voice weak and quiet. "No, I think you're right. This is a UFO." Leona and I exchanged a sidelong glance when we took our first steps across the threshold. A UFO with signs on the wall in plain English. Aliens with names like Dr. Harper Gerard. Cultive un serveur, as Leona would say. I didn't say anything out loud because I didn't have a better explanation, but I knew straight away whatever we'd found here wasn't extraterrestrial. It wasn't until we got to the final room at the other end of the ship that the horrifying truth revealed itself. The vast chamber we found before this only created further questions for us to torture ourselves with in the interim. It goes without saying that none of my knowledge of ancient civilizations was helpful. I'd stopped relying on prior experience the moment I saw the hatch. In this region of North America, you expect to be excavating lost ghost chute and Panamint holy sites, not ancient steel vessels that are somehow both rusted and more technologically advanced than anything you've ever seen. The middle section of the ship was mostly used as some kind of storage bay, from the looks of things. This much we could work out. It doesn't take a genius to recognize stacked crates, no matter how unfamiliar the plastic-like material they're made from looks. We were walking between stacks of these dark red crates for about 5 minutes when we emerged in the clearing we'd spied from back at the doorway, visible only because of the dancing and swirling lights above it on the distant ceiling. The heart of the ship was unlike any engine I've seen. Our torches were unnecessary. The hundreds of clear tubes sprouting from the floor-ceiling vat that made up the bulk of the engine's body were filled with a luminescent green liquid. It cast the engine in an emerald glow, carving out the array of components and mechanisms whose purposes I couldn't fathom with eerie chlorophyllic highlights. I could guess the purpose of the bulbous dome set into the base of the vat, though. You don't need a doctorate in esoteric engineering to work out the meaning of power level 2%. It was a battery, and thanks to a glass viewing port on the dome's face, I could see from where the ship drew its power. I could see it, but I'm not sure I could believe it. I'm still not sure I want to. There was a man inside. A man wearing a model blue mask of the same pearlescent metal as the hatch, although without the rust or corrosion. A man suspended in clear, bubbling fluid connected to the engine by the glowing tubes that ran from it into the hidden ducts in the ship's ceiling. A man that, as we could hear even through the thick glass and blue steel mask, was screaming. I couldn't tell you how old he was. That's why all 4 of us started screaming with him when we saw him. His age kept changing. He was flickering, phasing in and out of existence every few seconds as we watched at completely random intervals. When we arrived, his body was ancient, wizened and wrinkled and thin. Then he'd flickered like his body was disrupted by static on an old television set. When he emerged, he was middle-aged, only a year or so younger than Leona and me. After the next flicker, he was a baby, then in his 20s, then a child, then on the cusp of puberty. My God, Freddy was so taken aback he actually lowered the barrel of his shotgun. Scott was somewhere off in the shadows, being sick again. I know the eyes behind those glasses weren't sheepish anymore, unless Scott sobbed and blubbered when he was embarrassed. Leona's grip on my hand tightened. Mon Dieu, Robert. We have to help that poor soul. Aidez-moi à trouver une porte. I don't think there is a door, I replied, mouth dry. Don't touch it, we don't know what it is. I pulled her back towards me, stopping her from rushing to the shrieking man-boy baby with tubes painfully grafted to his back. Aside from the pearlescent blue steel mask, they were the only thing in this battery tank that didn't shimmer or flicker. Just the poor man-boy baby and his wretched twisted body. Unfortunately, I wasn't close enough to stop Freddy. Son of a bitch, we've got to get him out of there. Before any of us could stop him, he dropped the shotgun and was feeling around the rim of the viewing glass for a hatch or mechanism to open it. He was hammering on the flashing power level 2% screen when the alarm started going off. Alert! Non-classified personnel detected. Mission compromised. Flushing remaining distemporal assets. Flushing non-classified personnel. Alert! Non-classified. The darkness around us was piercing now with red as well as emerald lighting. A shrill ringing blasted from hidden speakers, competing with a repeating security message to see which could deafen us first. Even Scott had to stop puking to ram his fingers in his ears. I felt Leona's grip leave mine, though I'm not sure who let go of who. From somewhere up ahead in the darkness, from the depths of that ship we hadn't yet explored, I could hear a man scream even above the din. Because of what happened to Freddy and Scott, my own screams soon joined his. As soon as the message had repeated itself twice, dozens of needle-thin hooks on string-like steel cable shot up from the floor around both of them. They both yelled as the miniature barbed grapples found purchase on their skin. My ears screamed when I had to take my hands off them. But if I hadn't, I couldn't have held Leona back when the cables retracted. I'll never forget Freddy's face when the dozens of hooks snapped back into the floor. I'll never forget his screams as the barbs took lumps of his flesh with them. What will haunt me more is Scott's tears, the way I could see him mouthing for his mom, even after one of the pneumatic micro harpoons tore his bottom lip clean from his face, leaving teeth, gums, and jawbone exposed for display. The second wave of hooks followed the first, and just as quickly flayed whole sections of Freddy and Scott. By the time the rapid-fire onslaught of barbs and cable was finished, I was sobbing, backed into a corner, with Leona trying her hardest to bury herself forever in my chest. The ship's defense mechanism worked through both men like a school of piranha, turning them from men to a cloud of red mist to slack-jawed, glistening skeletons in a few short minutes. The hooks didn't stop there, though. They continued shooting and digging, slicing and crushing bones until nothing at all remained of the Americans in our party. Non-classified personnel flushed. Remaining distemporal assets flushed. Mission compromised. Breach report filed. Contemporary IPSET pickup initiated. Non-classified personnel. The new message repeated as loudly as the first, but at least the alarm had stopped. Neither of us was in much of a state to appreciate that, though. I was too busy crying like a bullied child. Leona was too busy jabbering nonsense in French. Somehow, one of us managed to compose ourselves, and then the other. I don't know which was which. I do know it was Leona that pointed out the scream from deeper in the ship. I was the one who wanted to run and never come back, and she was the one who won the argument. So it was we found ourselves, after another 5 minutes walking between more rows of dark red crates, at a second door. I think somehow I knew even then what would happen when I put my thumb to it, because I didn't jump as much as Leona did. It was still enough to make me yelp, though. The sight of that door unlocking and hissing open for my thumb filled me with dread and horror, second only to that spawned by the contents of the room beyond. It was a bedroom, a poorly lit, but remarkably clean and not rusted bedroom. There was a double bed against one wall, a desk, and a small tiled section in one corner with a curtain to hide a combination shower, toilet, sink space. It was a bedroom that had been lived in too. There were pens on the desk and a notepad and a half-eaten sandwich free of mold. There was a red book, face down on one pillow, and a cup of still steaming coffee on one of the bedside tables. There was even a microwave set into one wall. There were photographs next to the microwave, held on with plastic magnets to a bulky metal box, which I assume was a fridge. I recognized the people in those photos, even though the faces were older than when I'd seen them. So did Leona. She knew the woman with hair slightly grayer than her own stood with a team of scientists in one just as much as she knew the same even grayer woman in a modest wedding dress stood next to the man I recognized in another. He was in a lot of the photos, almost always with her. I knew his hairline even if there was less of it. I knew the mole on his chin too. That alone would have been enough to prompt Leona and me to turn and run from the ship as fast as we could. We did, but not just because of how familiar yet old the couple in the photographs was. We ran because, at the opposite end of the room, were two glowing green pods. Both had Dr. Harper Gerard above them on steel plaques. One was empty, a trail of glistening footprints leading from it to the shower toilet space, to the fridge area, then microwave, desk, and out the door. The other had a man in it, a man wearing a rubber suit with an Ipset Dr. Harper Gerard badge, a man with thick black sludge pumping into him from the tubes head into his mouth. Even though his eyes were crossed, there was blood pouring from his nostrils and tar-like slime pooling at his chin. I knew his face as well as I knew my own. Because, despite a few more wrinkles and a little more male-patterned baldness, it was. We'd been running so hard and fast that both of us had to stop and retch when we found ourselves back in the pit. I do remember that it was I who took Leona's hand the second time. Seeing my dead self in some kind of stasis pod broke me. I think it was also the final piece of the "Who was a Dr. Harper Gerard Freddy shot" puzzle that snapped Leona too, because she didn't resist. She didn't stop to ask me why, or swear in French. She just ran with me. She ran with me all the way to the hire car. She ran with me all the way to the airport, on the flight back to London, to my old home. She's been running with me since the Ipset spooks showed up outside our house, even though we changed our names and went to great lengths to burn every paper trail. She was running with me all the way until early this morning, when they finally got her. We've been moving around the UK for the last 4 years. We thought we'd be safe in somewhere as remote and forgotten as Dovercourt. We were wrong. They're nearly at the car I'm hiding under now. They've been chasing me on foot across Essex County all day. It's nearly midnight. I'm tired. They keep saying they just want to talk, to ask a couple of questions about what we'd seen in Nevada. They keep telling me that Leona is safe. I believe them, but I'm still not going. I know that once I do, everything will be fine. And somehow, in a few years, I'll find myself agreeing to be frozen in that damn time machine. Someone, probably Leona, will convince me that if we can set the awakening date just a little earlier, we'll be able to change things this time around. There'll be some reason we had to go back too, of course. Some apocalypse event so disturbing, so horrific, that decent people like Leona and I will agree to travel in a time machine powered by a temporally displaced human in an arcane mask. That's why I'm hiding under the car. Destiny has called me, but I don't want to answer. I don't want to join IPSET. I don't want to save the world. I already tried, and I already failed. The version of me that got out from under the car is dead, filled with black sludge somewhere, and rotting in a stasis chamber underneath the Nevada desert. I know it won't be any different when it's my turn. If you're reading this, please, somehow, volunteer yourself. I know one of you will be crazy enough to want to try this suicide mission in my place. I know there'll be plenty of you who hate your own mundane lives enough to pick apart the IPSET puzzle, to give your life purpose by sacrificing it to prevent whatever this apocalypse is. You might hate your life enough to want that. I don't. I've only got a few decades left before I'm officially old. I want to spend them with Leona, just not like this. I don't want to die as a distemporal asset. I don't want to spend my last seconds with a toxic purge fluid being flushed through my system, choking and in agony because my younger self allows Freddy to set off a security failsafe. I don't want to kiss Leona goodbye in the future, knowing what happens when she opens the hatch in the past. Our future selves weren't that much older than us. We'd finally found each other after all these decades. We deserve more time. It's not fair. I'm a coward and I'm not ashamed of that. I don't want to die like my future self, cold and alone outside of my own present. I refuse for that to be my destiny. I'm not a martyr or a savior or some kind of chrononaut. I'm just a guy, a scared, helpless guy, hiding under a car. Please, someone else step up and be the tragic hero of this story. I never asked to discover my future self in a time machine at an archaeological dig. This has been a reading of We Unearthed a Time Traveler's Ship at an Archaeological Dig by Toucan the Rapper. Thank you very much, Toucan the Rapper, for letting me read this story. What a great story. If you want to read more by Toucan the Rapper, please do head over to Reddit and check out his page. Links are in the description. And now it's time to dim the bat signal and say goodnight. Don't let the bats bite.